that living with a narcissistic person who expresses their rage overtly is like living with things that could blow up at any time, and you never know how badly the explosion's going to be or when it'll go off. And this can result in lifelong hypervigilance, being on edge. Let's talk a little bit about bullying, but more specific about when people are bullied in narcissistic family systems. This word bullying is an interesting one. Sort of our apocryphal take on what a bully is that surly, oversized kid at school who is waiting for you at the school gate, or steals lunch money, or puts really terrible stuff online, or is otherwise a menace that torments one or more kids at school. And that's one version. And it's, like I said, in the online world, this whole bullying thing has gone to a whole new level. But we know overall bullying goes much further. By definition, bullies go after vulnerable folks. Bullying is repetitive, and it is based on intimidation and coercion. Bullying can involve humiliation, mockery, physical threats, and it's always predicated on the bully going after someone who has less power than them. And that imbalance is sort of a central pillar of the concept of bullying. But we know that bullying doesn't just happen on a schoolyard, right? It can also happen in workplace settings. Workplace bullying is a very real thing, where a boss or even a more senior colleague bullies and intimidates less empowered colleagues. And the less power those colleagues have, the more bullied they may be. Lots of people would say that their first experience with bullying was school. Clearly, the bullies, I have to say, probably aren't watching this channel, but by and large, that's when most people were first bullied. However, if you're from a narcissistic family system, I'm willing to hazard a guess that perhaps some of your first experiences with bullying may very well have happened within the confines of your family system. Families, narcissistic families, are sadly, they're set up for bullying like almost no other system, right? Children are vulnerable people. Parents, caregivers are more powerful people. That's sort of built into the system. Now, obviously, when a family is healthy and loving, there's no bullying. But that's not what's happening in the narcissistic family system. And some of this can also come down to siblings. Remember those family roles we always talk about? Golden child, scapegoat, peacekeeper, fixer, invisible child, all of that. A lot of that can come down to who is being bullied. And by definition, the scapegoat is invariably the bullied one. Now, the primary way that bullying can show up in narcissistic family systems is often called mobbing, or specifically something called family mobbing, whereby the family bully has what we call either their flying monkeys or at the very least their accomplices, who may not be directly involved in the bullying, but who support and reward and sort of cheer on the bully. Like I said, this could be literally cheering the bully on, or laughing about the harm that the bully is inflicting on the other person, to almost like building on the bully's power to pile on to the person already being bullied and magnifying their own senses of power, right? The co-mobbers, as it were, may or may not be bullies themselves. And in family systems, the sort of joining in on the bullying may also be a trauma-bonded form of survivalism to stay attached to or safe from the core bullier, who is often a parent or a caregiver, but it could also be an older sibling. And for those who were mobbing accomplices in a family system, but not bullies themselves and not narcissistic, down the road, they may experience shame and a sense of complicity that becomes their load to carry and work through. Now, family bullying makes family systems incredibly unsafe from the jump. And to be in a bullied family system can impede attachment, psychological safety, identity development, and sense of self. It can also, by extension, affect engagement in school, foster a sense of the bullied child being distracted. Basically, the child has now gotten the message that even the most fundamental structure, the family, is not safe. But family bullying doesn't stop in childhood. It can trail well into adulthood. And we often see a sort of organized psychological abuse and control that can pervade a person's life as long as they have contact with the bully, who may no longer physically be as imposing, because you've grown up too, but will continue to bully through intimidation, humiliation, verbal aggression, and fostering a sense of isolation of the person they're bullying. While family bullying in a narcissistic family system can affect multiple, I mean, in this case, I'm using a victim just to keep things simple. I don't love the word, right? But multiple victims, it can do that, or it can all be focused on one scapegoated person in the family system. Some of this may come down to how large the family system is, more people to go after, the ages of the kids in the system, you know, whether it's still like the biological parents, step parents, all of that, right? But in a narcissistic family system, and especially when the violence is not physical, but rather emotional or psychological or verbal, it can be more difficult to spot these bullying patterns. Hell, I have seen adult family systems bully family members through group text and social media. Power is power, and bullies need it no matter what, even if everyone's grown up and we're no longer talking about kids. Think about what bullying does to people. We know that bullying saps people's sense of power in the world. It leaves people in a chronic state of fear. And the bullied person will try all sorts of workarounds to avoid the bully's wrath. But because the bullying dynamic can often usurp or steal a person's autonomy, the bullied person often faces one of two extremes. They either desperately try to flee the system, or they get imprisoned into it. There's really no middle ground. The fleeing the bullying system can be tricky because it can often mean a person throwing themselves into the world without being developmentally ready or having the resources or the preparation or the guidance. So the person fleeing one bullying system may enter new spaces in a very vulnerable way and be at risk for being preyed upon by new perpetrators. For example, let's say somebody flees the system and moves out too young with an older boyfriend or something. Or people get stuck because the bullying rhetoric sticks and you actually believe that you are all of the terrible things you were told. And then the bully has, the bullying parent could have the adult child or whatever family members involved forever sort of in their power and stuck. So this begs the question, are all bullies narcissistic? I mean, bullies likely take in, there's probably more territory here, but the vast majority are in that antagonistic world of narcissism, psychopathy, sociopathy, or a mix of antagonistic qualities. There are things like power-seeking, insecure, poorly regulated, impulsive, emotionally stunted, supply-seeking, lacking empathy, deeply entitled. You pour all those ingredients into a blender, you probably have a bully. And while all people with these characteristics don't bully, nearly all bullies have these characteristics. When we talk about school or workplace bullying, most of us are on the same page about the different ways it looks. But we less so use this languaging in families, where we may be more likely to soft pedal with the idea that, well, families are all different, or this might be how some families are, or maybe that's just a stern disciplinarian parent, or maybe it's cultural, or maybe everyone's just roughhousing, and maybe that's how siblings talk. Actually, no. And because family bullying tends to occur in the child who's still developing a sense of self, of self-worth, of attachment, it can upend these crucial developmental processes. In a family, bullying could be viewed as a sort of place of where coercive behavior meets narcissistic abuse, but it's long-term and severe. I personally think coercive control is a more structured terminology for what in essence is relationship bullying, where a person is chronically intimidated and humiliated and lives in fear of the menace held by the bullier or the narcissistic person or the coercer. Many of us have been bullied at various times in our lives. I'll own mine. When I was younger in school, throughout my K to 12, I was bullied. And the big takeaways I got from being chronically bullied was, I don't fit in anywhere. It's my fault. I wish I was cooler, prettier. I wish I was like the other kids. And the workarounds I had as a child were to hide, try not to attract attention to myself, leave school quickly before the bullies could catch up to me, walk home different ways so that they couldn't find me. And the physiological fallout for me as a child was everything from bedwetting to nightmares to solitude. So it very much fits a post-traumatic profile, in this case for a child. And the taking of responsibility, which I took onto myself, it's my fault for not being more socially skilled, similar to narcissistic abuse, and the sense of social exclusion can also connect to what happens to people who are being bullied in families. Social exclusion from peers is bad enough, but to have that impending sense of social exclusion in a family system feels like the stuff of terrifying children's stories of being put out into a cold and scary world on a cold and scary night. And that is the fear that bullied children live with, that your fate is tenuous within that bullying family system. I also remember a story back to middle school. It wasn't me being bullied. There was a terrible bully in the middle school. Even his mother was a bully. And he had lots of other boys who were part of his system, and they participated in the mobbing, right? The school was absolutely worthless in its responses. It was the damn 1970s. So it was like lawlessness and anarchy. And there was a boy in one of my classes who was a little bit odd, but he was smart. He was also quite tall, but kids went after him a lot. And that particular year was better than average for me because I wasn't experiencing as much bullying. But that really awful bully boy, he was not academically gifted, but he would taunt this boy who was in my class. One day, the boy in my class who was taunted yelled at the bully to stop. And the bully escalated and said he would see him after school right outside the school grounds for a fight. And the boy who was taunted, the bullied boy, agreed to it. I can still evoke the feelings from that day. What I was thinking about is like, yeesh. And I was terrified for the bullied boy. And the night before their proclaimed fight, I couldn't sleep. And I wasn't even friends with the kid that was going to get beaten up. Systems that permit bullying to happen harm everyone in them. The bully, though, actually disappeared from our school system. I think he went on to a different school, but I read about him years down the road. Bullied people typically blame themselves. They don't blame the system. And kids in particular don't have that luxury. And our survival need to maintain attachment means that we're going to come for ourselves quicker than we are willing to recognize that the system is effed. Schools still are not doing great with this, and social media and online abuse have created a terrible and problematic new paradigm for whatever the new equivalent is for waiting at the school fence. But we also don't like the destabilization that happens from having to recognize that systems like schools or systems like families are broken. But for those of you who felt you were bullied by a family and wonder if that is a thing or that you still are, it is a thing. It could be treated as something very close to chronic coercive control. And the harms, especially when it is within systems we are supposed to trust, like families, are significant. I think a lot of us understand one-on-one bullying quite well. It's a lot harder to get our heads around the idea that an entire system can be bullying. So back to the two forms of rage. There's overt aggression, rage, or anger. That shows up as yelling, screaming, throwing things, perhaps even physical violence. It is unmistakable and it is unsettling. If you, for example, grew up with a narcissistic parent, the overt rage may be something that still affects you. And when you are in the presence of rage and anger as an adult, that encoded and held response in your body can mean that being around angry people, especially ones who yell, doesn't work. Doesn't work for you. The overt aggression can show up in intimate relationships in a wide variety of ways. And over time, just the anticipation of the rage and anger are enough to keep a partner in line, with people walking on eggshells and holding back on doing or saying anything. And overt aggression, or the threat of it, is often a dynamic that's observed in relationships with malignant narcissistic folks. And it's sort of a clear dynamic. It's sort of the central kind of dynamic in coercively controlling relationships. Narcissistic bosses may be overly rageful, yelling and screaming at people in the workplace. And we've all heard the apocryphal stories or survived them of the raging, humiliating boss, or the boss that throws the laptop or the phone or the this and breaks the door and all of that. Narcissistic people are often too clever and too concerned with what people think of them to express or show their rage overtly. And instead, we will see that their rage and anger will often show up when we are alone with them. That can mean that you are living in two realities: the abusive one that few see, and the more charming or at least restrained ones that others see. Overt narcissistic rage and anger are set off in the way that all narcissistic rage is set off, through what we call an ego injury. And that ego injury could be because they were frustrated, because they were disappointed, because someone didn't read their mind, because someone was getting something better than them. So for example, someone else got the promotion they wanted or bought the car that they wanted to get. Even a passing critique can be enough to create an ego injury. So that means that living with a narcissistic person who expresses their rage overtly is like living with things that could blow up at any time, and you never know how badly the explosion's going to be or when it'll go off. And this can result in lifelong hypervigilance, being on edge, and what we call hyperarousal and chronic anxiety that can stay with you for a lifetime. Then there is passive aggression. While the overt aggression and rage are something we are more likely to see in malignant narcissistic folks, and perhaps in some grandiose folks, the passive aggression is the mothership of the vulnerable narcissistic folks. The passive aggression is typically expressed as withdrawing, withholding, one-word answers, talking through other people, things like you're sitting right there, but then they'll say, tell your mother that I need the car keys, that kind of thing. There may also be full-on silent treatment, as well as other passive-aggressive barbs thrown in. This could be things like them doing something so sloppily that you're like, you either end up doing it yourself and don't ask them to do it again because it was such a mess. They'll pretend that they didn't get a message and then not doing something that you were counting on them to do, thus leaving you in the lurch. Other little digs would be things like, oh, I saw that you got the groceries and you actually remembered the coffee this time that I like. Well, there's a surprise. Or they'll procrastinate on things that matter to you. And by procrastinating, that creates a mess and a world of headaches for you. Or they'll complain about a third party, but actually it reflects something you're doing. Like, oh gosh, I can't believe she does that. And yet it's something you do. It's exhausting. It's not scary, but it's exhausting. Passive aggression can be a part of the larger victim complex that characterizes so much of vulnerable narcissism. Anger is a universal experience in these relationships, but these two forms of anger can have very different effects on us. Let's start with the overt aggression. This is the stuff that can wreck your nervous system. The range of effects can be the stuff we see in PTSD, such as hypervigilance, avoidance. You may find yourself living in a chronic state of tension, not sleeping well, even having nightmares. You may feel a sense of dread at going home, dread of having to tell them something or ask them something. You may find yourself flinching or having hyperarousal symptoms like an accelerated heart rate or shortness of breath when you are around a rager, even if it's not the original narcissistic rager. Now, the passive aggression does something different to us. Not maybe, in some cases yes, but we may not see as much of the intense arousal and physiological reactions. However, as I said, for folks for whom abandonment, for example, is a core wound, the passive aggression and the withdrawing and withholding and silence can bring up those old feelings that can be felt as panic and wanting to fix it and make it normal. This can be compounded if there are children or other people around. And it is why people get so stuck in relationships with vulnerable narcissistic folks, because you are often just giving in to make the silent and withholding patterns stop. The other reaction here, especially if the abandonment is not so triggering, is that of exhaustion and depletion. Again, we get back to that dread, but now the dread isn't the fear of unpredictable anger, but rather the dread of the heaviness, the little digs, the proverbial death by 1,000 cuts that often goes alongside the passive aggression. It is exhausting to have to navigate the landmines of having to do things twice because the passive aggressor did them so poorly in the first place, and then plays victim if you point it out. In fact, plays victim if you point anything out. So there is no hope of communication or growth. It's just a horrible spiral of them behaving petulantly, sullenly, and like a spoiled child, and you feeling silenced because you just can't listen to the whole victimized rant again. And then over time, you have to be the only grown-up in the relationship. Passive aggression is particularly atrocious for children who don't understand why a parent withdraws or gives them the silent treatment. And it can be quite scary with children blaming themselves and, in essence, being sort of taught, being prepared to behave exactly the way the parent wants, because the child is trying to avoid the parent abandoning them and their inducing of guilt. The parent saying things like, well, everyone else has such easy children. Why are you so difficult? One of these, with the passive aggressive versus the overt aggressive, I don't believe that one is easier than the other. And frankly, most narcissistic relationships have both forms of anger housed in them. These two forms of anger may affect us all a little differently depending on our histories, with the folks who are enduring the chronic bouts of overt rage feeling more rattled and then ultimately desensitized by the emotional violence of the relationship, while the folks in the passive-aggressive relationships may feel more depleted and wrung out and maybe even depressed, because ultimately you may be avoiding the menace of brutal anger in your face, but the ongoing whining and victimhood is what you're experiencing, and it makes it too difficult to ask them to do anything. However, most narcissistic relationships favor one type of anger over the other. And if you have more than one of these relationships, you may find that you are having different experiences in these relationships, and the different ways of expressing rage may be part of why this is happening. Whatever it is, passive-aggressive rage, overt rage, any rage, it is not good for your health. So let's talk about the anatomy of a smear campaign. If you have been through a narcissistic relationship, especially more than one, then the odds are that you have likely been through a smear campaign. And many people will say that the smear campaign was as harmful, if not more so, than the relationship. Smear campaigns can show up in different ways. Some smear campaigns may be part of what's happening in the workplace. Some involve family, some your mutual friends, and some take in all of it. But all smear campaigns are designed and result in harm to your reputation, and you may feel you simply can never get ahead of it, and they can change your life. So let's look at the essential ingredients and framework of a smear campaign. So first, almost inevitably, a smear campaign involves a narcissistic or very manipulative antagonistic person. Smear campaigns are the tool of a vindictive, vengeful, insecure, controlling, obsessive, manipulative, entitled, emotionally immature person. It's a way for them to control the narrative and punish another person. Can people who are not narcissistic engage in smear campaigns? Of course, but I would put heavy odds in favor of, if you are going through a smear campaign, that the person who is engaged in it has got some sort of narcissistic vibe. Second element is that the narcissistic person, or the smear campaigner as it were, engaged in the smear campaign because they feel wronged in some way. Narcissistic people play the eternal victim, and they live their lives as though they are being persecuted all the time. So as a result, if anything leaves them feeling as though they are not being treated the way they believe they should be treated, or if they feel that they are losing control of the narrative or the relationship or the situation, all of these are catalysts for a smear campaign. The most common stimuli that set off a smear campaign include: you may end a relationship with them, or you quit a job with them, or you end a business partnership with them, or you distance yourself from them, and they do not want that to happen. Obviously, other things can set them off, but in general, smear campaigns begin because the narcissistic person feels wronged, and they are going to punish you. Narcissistic people are often self-righteous enough to believe that above all else they are in the right, and will literally frame it as though it is their moral duty to inform people of what a bad person you are. The third is that smear campaigns and smear campaigners are obsessive. When a narcissistic person is wronged, they become obsessed. The revenge fantasies and the vindictiveness literally overtake them, and they can't let it go. Even when other people around them may tell them, like, dude, it's enough, like, let it go, it's over. It's not that big a deal. The egotistical nature of narcissism is that they cannot stand the idea that someone got something over on them. So for example, let's say you're going through a divorce with them, and the settlement is not what they wanted it to be. They will lose their minds, and it really does become a vendetta. In a way, a smear campaign is a narcissistic person launching the worst punishment that they can think of, which is to ruin someone's reputation, because narcissistic people care so desperately about what people think of them. It can feel like the ultimate revenge for them to bring someone down in this way. A narcissistic person looking for revenge doesn't relent. And I know this may bum some of you out, but these smear campaigns can last a long time, like years in some cases. And people will wonder why the narcissistic person doesn't lose steam. Obviously, some narcissistic folks or some smear campaigners may lose interest, maybe once they find new supply. But there is a certain point where the vengeance and the vindictiveness turn into a sort of gratification that they can still keep messing with you, even when they moved on into new things. This is an important point because it allows you to be prepared that the narcissistic person will even accuse you of engaging in a smear campaign. If, for example, let's say you choose to talk to one close person in your world about your breakup and they come to find out you did. However, one conversation with a friend or someone close to you to help you cope is not the same as the obsessive full-scale campaign of the narcissistic person. Fourth, smear campaigns are about speed. The narcissistic person will very quickly try to get to other people first. And that's not to say that you were trying to get to anyone or trying to engage in any kind of smear campaign, but that the narcissistic person will start talking to people about you and about what happened before you even get the chance to tell other people that, for example, maybe your relationship ended or you quit the job. The smear campaigner will also start with soft targets, enablers, the most manipulatable people in your midst, people who may have already had a soft spot for them, who are more naive, who are more suggestible. If this was an election what you would argue is that the smear campaigner would start with their base. And that sort of creates a community that they have now started to populate with these accusations about you. At this point, you may even get calls or inquiries asking you if these things are true. Or you may even find that people are pulling away from you and you don't understand why, because they don't tell you. The fifth thing that we see in a smear campaign is that the smear campaigner will make plausible accusations. The fact is, none of us are perfect. And this really matters if this is a longer relationship. And because narcissistic people are actually quite astute in their study of people, and especially the vulnerabilities and weaknesses of people who are close to them, and how the people in their life relate to other people, they may know exactly what to say to each of the different people in a smear campaign. So they may tell a friend, for example, let's say this is a friend you've always had a friendly rivalry with. They may tell the friend that you often put that friend down and that it actually wasn't such a friendly rivalry. So the things that they're saying about you to these other people aren't from left field. And as a result, the people hearing them may sort of hold on to the idea that there's a certain believability. The sixth thing is that the narcissist, as part of the smear campaign, will share things you told them in confidence. And especially if this was a close relationship and a long relationship, you may have shared opinions with them about people that you never wanted shared with those people. And they will use those as part of their arsenal in the smear campaign. Again, the narcissistic person moves fast. So they're getting to people early. So even if you slowly over time get to the point that you talk to these people, well, the well has already been poisoned, because it's quite likely that these people have heard that you said terrible things about them. And listen, it may not even be that the narcissistic person shares confidential stuff. They just may make stuff up. Now, the narcissistic smear campaign is not just the narcissistic person saying outlandish things or giving a laundry list of the terrible things you did in the relationship that are not true, but rather they also share things with other people that actually may be true, and like I said, never should have been shared. And then they will follow that with accusations of things you did in the relationship that are not true. But now the person hearing about you from the narcissist may now believe them, because they are hearing the bad things you said about them. So they're kind of mad at you. There is a bit of an indoctrination process in a smear campaign, whereby the narcissistic person or the smear campaigner tests the waters to see whether the person that they're going to tell the terrible things to is open to it. And sadly, most people are open to gossip. So once the smear campaigner realizes that the door is cracked open, they will then gradually creep it and push it open more and more widely and say more and more negative things about you. Number 7, the smear campaign's inner structure is held up by triangulation and gossip. In a smear campaign, there's a lot of telling that the narcissist telling each person in the campaign different slices of the story, and sometimes even turning people within the campaign against each other so they don't talk to each other and share stories, and so that the people within the campaign won't share stories and potentially support you. A foundational piece of the smear campaign is gossipy secrets. And as I said, the narcissistic smear campaigner tests the waters first to see if the person they want to share the smeary talk with is open to it. And then they may even say something like, well, it's good to hear that, it's good to see or good to know that you actually want to hear the truth. Your sister was in total denial and was just like, la, 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 I don't want to hear it. But yeah, your sister is also casting shade on you and your family. So you see how they do it? They say, well, this person don't want to hear it. Well, that's because there's something wrong with them. So there can almost be smear campaigns within smear campaigns in a way to separate all the people on the receiving side of the smear campaign again, so they may not compare notes. Number 8, Smear campaigners are like a special ops team. They get in and they get out fast, clean, lean, and mean, and don't leave that much of a trace. They may set it up that they just sort of run into someone, and so it can feel like, oh, this is a coincidence, funny to see you here. It's not funny, it wasn't a coincidence. And then they will often just sprinkle some innuendo into a conversation in this place they just sort of ran into you with. So it goes relatively unnoticed. The other thing that smear campaigners will do is just kind of keep it casual and conversational. They won't do stuff in writing, won't even send a text. So even legal remedies like slander or defamation actions become quite challenging. And they may build some of their smear campaign on enough of a kernel of truth that it's enough that they get to slide by. And ultimately, it deteriorates into sort of a they said, you said kind of a thing. And that also leaves you in the position of you may not have the money and resources to spend on an attorney. Number 9, one day you may confront them about the smear campaign, and I can all but guarantee that they will deny they are doing it. And then they will call you crazy and paranoid for thinking there's a smear campaign, or say that you're the one who's narcissistic because you think everything is about you. So they will gaslight. They will deny the reality, even if you show them evidence of the smear campaign, and then call you crazy and say that's why they left the relationship, even though you were the one who ended it with them. This can be extremely destabilizing, frustrating, and evoke even more feelings of helplessness and hopelessness, because really you may feel unable to stop the smear campaign. And the narcissistic person, may even run with this and paint you as even more unhinged to the people who are already hearing the smear campaign. Some people will confront just to give the smear campaigner a sort of like, hey, I see you, I see what you're doing. Others won't ever confront the narcissistic smear campaigner and may even be afraid of the smear campaigner and just go full no contact. Number 10, again, the smear campaigner won't outright, in most cases, though in some cases they will, write fully defamatory things about you on social media. But it will be implied with mysterious, ambiguous posts and pictures. They may write sort of posts full of innuendo, passive-aggressive posts, that kind of thing. They tend to hold off on doing this until they go to individual players first, and then they level up. Let's face it, when adults, grown-ass adults, are doing this kind of stuff on social media, it looks immature and ridiculous. Again, not all smear campaigners do this, but the more insecure, the more attention-seeking, validation-seeking, and really emotionally immature the smear campaigner is, the more likely they will do this. But they will do it tactically, and oftentimes, but not always, but oftentimes in a way that will not get them into trouble. And 11, the final piece of this is grief. Your grief. Because it is the painful recognition, not only to have to keep going through this, but that there were people in your midst, people you trusted, people you even loved, that were willing to believe this shit and even distance from you without, in some cases, even talking to you or reaching out to tell you what they were told so you can have a conversation with them about it. A smear campaign is already such a destabilizing experience because it can cause you significant reputational harm. As a parent in your community, for example, in your children's school, in professional settings, within a large extended family system, including in-laws, in a friend group. And this can sort of create this gray cloud around you in multiple systems. And this can be even worse if they did share confidential things. You said that you did say that you said to them when you once believed that you could trust the narcissistic person, or things that you never wanted anyone else to hear. It does become a horrible way to get forced into having to restructure your social world. You may recognize that some folks who could believe this about you without questioning may not ever have had your back. You may attempt to make amends with others who heard things you never wanted them to hear, or who shared things you never intended them to see. You may attempt to have conversations with people to clear the air. But when it's over, your social world may never look the same. When you break up with a normal person who is not narcissistic, it's painful, but it's not this. Smear campaigns are sadly a more common tool than you would actually know of the narcissistic, vindictive, and the emotionally stunted. As your grief slowly unfolds, you may find that creating a new world takes time, but it happens. And in some cases, people may even physically move away from where they were to get a fresh start. I have also heard from folks who have told me that they were minimized when they shared with other people that they had been the focus of a smear campaign. These smear campaigns are real, and they can bring up tremendous harm, loss, isolation, confusion, fear, anxiety, helplessness, anger, and real professional damage. Seeking out therapy and other support can be crucial because so many folks who go through smear campaigns are gaslighted about their experience. And that is one thing you don't need any more of. So if you have gone through this, recognize that it's real, it's harmful, it takes a tremendous psychological toll, and it can really sort of change the forward path of your life. Big question we get, and something we probably should talk about more, is vindictiveness, and more specifically, how do you protect yourself from a narcissistic person's vindictiveness? Let's start at the top. You've really got to be aware this is a thing. Vindictiveness is such a core element of narcissistic relationships. I'm not talking about schadenfreude. I'm not talking about passive aggression. I'm talking about active, they're going to get in there and mess up with your stuff, vindictiveness. Now, vindictiveness, like everything narcissism related, is on a continuum. At the maybe lower levels of vindictiveness, they may pass a little unpleasant gossip about you. They may sort of have some uncomfortable social media posts about things related to you. They may tell someone something that leads you to not having an opportunity, right? But as we go up the continuum all the way to extreme vindictiveness, it can actually be terrifying. They may dox you. They may get you into legal trouble. They may sue you. They may make it so you lose your job. They may put you in physical harm. Obviously, that's a continuum, and someone passing a rumor about you is very different than the other. But no matter what, I don't think I've ever seen a case of a narcissistic relationship where there wasn't some vindictiveness, when someone stood up to them and, more importantly, sort of pulled the plug on the relationship. So the first step is sometimes understanding the why helps, but we don't want to spend too much time on the why. Number one, that it's going to happen. Number two, what's the why? Narcissistic people have to be in power. They have to dominate. And above all else, they have to win. So if you do something like try to break up with them, try to pull them off a project, whatever it is, fire them, anything, not invite them to a family event, that's an ego injury. And usually the ego injury is the catalyst for the vindictiveness. Because in essence, when their ego is injured, they've lost power. It brings up shame. They're going to get that power back. And there's no more surefire way for them to get power back by seeking out vengeance, by being vindictive. And like I said, it can range from petty to terrifying, but it's always a way for them to feel the ship has sort of righted itself. So the bigger questions, we know they're going to be vindictive. You can set a clock by it. Vindictiveness, for example, is a big part of post-separation abuse. So it's in essence, the post-separation abuse is you're going to pay. You're going to pay for trying to take my money in a divorce. You're going to pay for trying to split up with me. You're going to pay for making me look bad. Whatever their psychology is around, for example, a breakup, you're going to pay. That's why we see post-separation abuse. So now to the protection. Number one, you got to know, like I said, what it is. You got to know it's coming. If the more something unexpected happens to us, the less prepared we are for it. Now, it's hard to prepare for vindictiveness, but sometimes it may mean getting legal stuff in order, having all the documentation you need. Sometimes it even means preparing people. You may literally say to friends, hey, I'm about to break up with such and such. I'm giving it about a week and they're going to call you and say terrible things about me. I need you to be prepared for that. You may tell an employer that this is what's happening and such is going to happen. If you're concerned there's a dangerousness issue, you might involve security in it. And I have to say that in the most severe and awful kinds of narcissistic vindictiveness stories where people were physically harmed or even killed, those hoofbeats were sounding. You could tell that kind of vindictiveness was souping up. And I think a lot of people say there's no way they would go there. If someone's narcissistic, please always know there's a possibility that there is a way that someone could go there, and always be prepared. So that means safety plans. Like, for example, if you do break up with someone where it has been tense at times of these perceived abandonments, when you're like, I can't do this anymore, make sure there's someone there with you. But it is about preparing for it, is knowing it. Knowing it's likely going to happen, and then taking whatever actions you need to take. Some people be like, oh, you're exaggerating. It's not going to be that bad. Okay, if these people want to gaslight you, A, file that away for later discernment, but B, better that you're prepared. And maybe the narcissistic person never does reach out to your friends. Maybe they do disappear off into the sunset. I ain't taking that bet. But then people are saying, ooh, she said this was coming, and here we are. That as long as you're aware, because I have to tell you that some of the worst narcissistic vindictiveness I ever experienced was early, when I was just at the early stages of doing this work, and even before I was doing this work. And I think I was so caught unawares that I was really destabilized, and I was having these huge whole body reactions of panic. Had I been a little prepared, and when I look at the character of the person involved, I absolutely should have been prepared that this was going to happen, I would have done things very, very differently in my life. Number 3, you don't, as expensive as it may be, sometimes you just got to call a lawyer. And I know it sucks, especially if you don't have lots of money. If you really have no money, it might involve working with a local legal aid organization. It might mean working with a local domestic violence organization. If you do have money, find someone you trust and involve them. Many times what lawyers will tell you is that, sadly, when it comes to narcissism, because the stuff they're doing often doesn't go over that line, whether it's like online abuse, online harassment, coming after you, passing these kinds of rumors, you'd be surprised how much has to happen. But if you talk to someone legally, you might be able to figure out what are the things you can and can't do that can keep you sort of protected if it has more of that sort of legal feel to it. Number 4, the thing to keep in mind is a lot of the vindictiveness can take the form of a smear campaign. Smear campaigns are a very, very common way. And the smear campaign is sort of like 2 types of pain for the price of 1. Number 1, not only do you have this experience of vindictiveness sort of coming at you, but number 2 is that they're now involving people you once thought were your friends, your allies, and your supporters, and they're coming at you too, sort of doing the bidding and gaslighting for the narcissistic person. So you're experiencing grief about that part of it and fear about the first part. Again, smear campaigns are very real, and they're a very big part of the narcissistic person's vindictiveness toolbox. We tend to see it happen more. Sometimes grandiose narcissists tend to have bigger social networks, so they can often pull it off a little bit better. But I think again, being prepared for that. At the end of the day, when a smear campaign is done, you learn something very uncomfortable to learn, but you do learn who your people are. Because the people who didn't succumb to the smear campaign, the people who did stand by you, the people who did support you, those are your people. And the people who did succumb to that smear campaign, you might want to put them on the back burner, be much more discerning, and probably disengage. And if they play naive, like, I didn't know, you just need smarter friends. You don't need to hang out with them anyhow. So you learn something in a smear campaign, but while it's happening, it can be utter devastation. Not only the fear, like I said, of the vindictiveness, but the grief around what other people are doing. But I think, and then finally, what you really want to be aware of is that a lot of times people around you are going to minimize this concept of vindictiveness. Oh, it's not going to be that bad. Oh, it's not that bad. Oh, they're just hurt. But meanwhile, you might be having very strong somatic and physiological reactions. You might be ruminating about it. You might be wondering, maybe I should have just gone along and not have to live through this. So you're going through something very, very real psychologically. And if you have a history of long-term narcissistic abuse in this and in other relationships, or a history of trauma, just that sort of somatic exhaustion that you will be experiencing when this is coming at you. Now, vindictiveness in its most severe form is obviously going to happen in the most severe narcissistic relationships, relationships with more malignant narcissists, people more severe on that continuum, longer term relationships where breaking the relationship has more consequences, has more of a public effect. Obviously, those are the cases where you might see more extreme vindictiveness. But I got to tell you, one of the worst cases of narcissistic vindictiveness I experienced was with someone I actually didn't know very well. So it may not always be that in this case. So the person was almost psychopathic. Like it was that severe. So understanding that multiple things can be playing in, but more than anything, I want this video to ungaslight any of you that have ever experienced narcissistic vindictiveness, because this is on top of all the fear, the anxiety, and the discomfort that the vindictiveness brings out in you. The other thing that happens is that when everyone around you is minimizing it or actually painting you out as paranoid and crazy, it can take this experience and make you even more destabilized. Narcissistic vindictiveness is very real. It can make decision-making really hard. And even when you feel in every bone in your body, I got to get out of this, it's enough to make you scared, which is why you often need support, therapy, sometimes attorneys, sometimes advocates, to help you with your decision-making process and to ensure that you're safe, or at least supported as you go through the transition or decision-making in any narcissistic relationship. Thanks again.